Welcome! In this video, I want to take a look at the beginner monsters. These are the ones that any new hunter will face at the start of their journey in the series, and this will by no means be a comprehensive list. Instead, this will be about the vibes of the early monsters and the categories I feel they fall into. We'll be looking at what each group teaches you about the game, and some personal little tidbits about the progression in their armor sets. Let's begin by looking at the first group of monsters. These are the pack leaders, or the small monsters all grown up. When you start playing the game and explore your first locale, you may see these little guys. These are small monsters, and usually your first proper quest will have you taking down a group of them, and once you've done that, you'll be tasked with defeating your first large monster, a bigger version of those little guys. These are all the great insert name here monsters. Think of the Great Baggy, Izuchi, Roggy, Jagras, Macau, and my favorite, Great Jaggy, who isn't present in the newer titles unfortunately. They don't really teach you anything too specific about the game, but they serve as your first hunt against a large monster. As the introduction to the whole game, or the gameplay loop rather, they're generally very easy to deal with, their attacks are very telegraphed, they don't deal too much damage, and they don't have a gimmick, except for maybe a status or element. This serves as a great introduction to the feeling of the game. Both you and the monsters have wind-ups to your attacks, and if you or the monster misses, you have a chance to punish them. This teaches you that each attack is a commitment, and if you commit at the wrong time, you get punished. You start looking for little windows in between their attacks, or creating those windows by dodging their attacks, giving you an opportunity to land your own. These monsters also plant the seed for something that the player won't realize until later, which I will definitely touch on further into the video. On a more subjective note, their armors are very simple, and for this part of the game, I think they're a fantastic hook into the gameplay loop. They've all got a fairly similar aesthetic. They kind of look like normal chainmail or plate armor with some monster parts slapped onto them. In my head, I could see this being a really fun way to differentiate people while on a multiplayer hunt, without having one person stand out too much. Of these monsters, my favorite armor set is definitely the Great Jaggy, but since he doesn't really exist right now, I'm a big fan of the Great Baggy set. It's simple and feels like a standard issue uniform for any hunter, which to me is the perfect vibe you want out of a beginner set. This group of monsters aren't too different from the first we looked at, but I wanted to differentiate them because they act a little different and they teach you something different than the first group. Unlike the Greats, these are standalone monsters, with no small monsters to foreshadow them. As such, when you first encounter them, you have no concept of how they'll fight. You're going into this hunt blind, and as you attack, something new happens. You're likely to encounter that some damage numbers are appearing white, and you might even bounce. But you'll also notice that this doesn't happen on every part of the monster. It's just one part. So, for the Lagombi, it's on its rear legs and abdomen, the parts important for its mobility, and for the Arzuros, it's the arms, which it uses for a majority of its attacks and to dig for honey. I briefly want to mention that, independent of gameplay, this is fantastic creature design. Those body parts being a little tougher to hit makes sense if they generally rely on them for mobility and for foraging respectively. It's a small detail, but it really helps making those monsters feel more natural in the world. Anyways, what this teaches you is that some monster parts are harder to hit than others. This is a very intuitive way to understand hit zones, the areas where certain types of damage are more or less effective on a monster. Seeing the white numbers and noticing that you're dealing less damage than you normally would with a yellow number, you're naturally incentivized to target the spots that produce the yellow numbers. And this is done without giving you a pop-up menu about it or an in-depth tutorial. Instead, you get to learn this through gameplay. After learning that with these two, you go on to apply that same information with every monster. Now, to talk about their armors and weapons, these are probably my favorite of this whole group of intro monsters. The Great Izuchi and Great Roggy both have really fun and interesting sets, but there's something really unique and pretty to me about the Lagombi and Arzuros sets. They feel a step more detailed than the Great Baggies, but a step below the more cool and fantastical Izuchis and Roggys. I personally really enjoy the more rustic, tribal, grounded elements of the series. so they speak more to my sensibilities. These two groups of monsters, the early raptors and bears, all serve to introduce the player to the general rules of the game. So far we've learned 1. If you miss, you get punished. 2. If the monster misses, or if you make them miss, you can punish them. And 3. Some monster parts are harder to hit than others. These are the stepping stones into the general gameplay loop and the ideas of the game that will be important moving forward, but it's not until the next group of monsters that those things get solidified. These are the first group of monsters that have some kind of gimmick. You've got Akhenasom, Bishaten, Royal Ludroth, Baroth, and Tetranodon. Each of these monsters have some kind of gimmick that you come to understand early on in the hunt. Akhenasom primarily uses its beak to burrow, Bishaten stands on its tail, Royal Ludroth inflates its sac to deal water damage, Tetranodon can inflate its stomach, changing its bite, and Baroth has a shield of hardened mud. Unlike the raptors and the bears, these monsters teach you that some monsters have a gimmick that you have to deal with during the hunt. As you fought the raptors or the bears, you might have noticed a part break or two. For those two groups of monsters, this doesn't affect them too much, but for these 5, it certainly does. For these 5, breaking or targeting the part that affects their gimmick affects the hunt, making it easier to deal with them. Akhenasom takes a little more time getting its balance after it burrows. Bishaten takes a little more time getting its balance after it stands on its tail, and it falls out of its stances faster. Royal Ludroth gets tired more often. Tetranodon spits out all the water, giving you a huge opportunity to deal damage. And Baroth loses its shell, making it easier to hit. These hunts teach you about the importance of targeting certain body parts. And, as they're a step above the raptors and the bears, you'll notice that their armors are a little more elaborate and themed than the previous group. Akhenasam's set looks like a suit of armor, Bishaten looks like a Tengu costume, Royal Ludroth's is a huge rubber raincoat, Baroth looks kind of like a rook chess piece, and Tetranodon looks like someone trying to wear a ghillie suit. Of this group, I think I prefer Baroths or Bishatens. I think they each explore something kind of fun in their designs. Now, the next two monsters are in standalone groupings because they don't really fit with any of the other monsters, but the things they teach and do for the player are still worth talking about. Basarios is an infamous monster, and although it's been toned down from its previous iterations, it still kind of is annoying. Looking back at the lesson from Arzuros and Lagambi, we learned that some monster parts are harder to hit. We encountered that same idea with Baroth, whose mud armor we were able to overcome. Basarios, however, is all rock, and as such, when you first encounter it, most, if not all, of your weapon attacks will bounce off of it. This is in part due to the low sharpness level of the early game, because once you hit high rank or master rank, most of your attacks will land, assuming you're using high sharpness. But in the early game, that's not the case. What Basarios does is effectively wall you into doing one of two things. You either figure out which of your weapon's attacks ignore sharpness, like the longsword spear combo or the gun lance's shell attacks, maybe even switching weapons until you find one that can ignore sharpness, or you just wail on it until it dies while bouncing. There's no way of getting around Basarios except getting through it. So, it's to my understanding that Basarios is meant to teach the player that sometimes you have to think about changing up your playstyle. Basarios teaches you that some weapons are better for some kind of monsters, because if you're playing Gunlance, then you probably didn't have any problems against it, as the Gunlance shells ignore hit zones. But if you're playing Sword and Shield, this monster probably felt brutal. To me, a key aspect of playing these games is being a monster hunter, not a weapon specialist. You're meant to swap between weapons and different armor sets because you want to be using what's most effective for that specific monster. At the very least, That's what I think it ought to be, and it feels very much important in the early game. The Basarios armor set is also great for the gunlance, which I think is a fun touch and makes sense for the monster. Its armor set is huge and bulky, reflecting the monster's own behaviors and aesthetics, and while it looks pretty gaudy compared to the rest of what we've encountered, I think it still looks fairly grounded. Towards the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there was a seed planted during the first few hunts. I think by the time the player reaches this particular monster, that seed begins to sprout, completely unbeknownst to the player. Rathian is one of 2 monsters that has appeared in every single title across the entire franchise, and is also the player's first introduction to the Flying Wyvern, the most populated group of monsters in the franchise. In my opinion, Rathian is the foundation and the true introduction to the series, because Rathian is proof of something the player already knows. Up to this point in your journey, you might have noticed something. Some monsters fight pretty similar to each other, and in some cases, nearly identical. This was probably most notable with the raptors from the first little section. They fight functionally the same, save for a status or element here and there. It isn't to the same degree, but this is the case for every wyvern type, the classification of each monster. For instance, most brute wyverns are bipedal and feature some form of a tackle or ramming attack. Most fanged wyverns are quadrupedal and are generally agile, and most flying wyverns are bipedal and have wings for arms, though there are exceptions to all of these. You could chalk up the similarities to the reusing of models or lazy game design, or you could see it as an artistic choice to reflect a monster's biology, which is what I feel it is. In our world, most birds have wings and can fly, but they also have their own gimmicks or behaviors that make them unique from one another. In the same way, you can expect a woodpecker and an eagle to be capable of flight. You can do the same for a Rathian and a Ceregios. Rathian brings this lesson full circle. It's always the simplest flying wyvern you could face in any game, and as such, feels kind of like the tutorial for the flying wyvern. And because she is, in my mind, she teaches you the general feeling of all flying wyverns. You don't realize this as a player until you begin to face others, like the Rathalos or the Astalos, that the lessons you learned in the Rathian hunt also pay off for those hunts. Rathian's armor also feels kind of emblematic of that. It's got the really grounded style of armor, as well as the more fantastical elements of Rathian spikes and scales slapped onto parts of it. I think Rathian marks the end of the lessons that you learn with early monsters. So let's take a look at the full picture. By the time you've hunted a Rathian, you've learned 1. If you miss, you get punished. 2. If the monster misses, or if you make them miss you, you can punish them. 3. Some monster parts are harder to hit than others. 4. Some monster parts are important to a hunt. 5. Some monsters require a different, more specific strategy. And 6. A monster's type tells the player how that monster is likely to fight. And with that, you've come to understand how Monster Hunter works in general. I think this series does a pretty good job of tutorializing the player through its gameplay. The pop-up menus and the subscreens are always very overwhelming for new players, and what's worse is that I think they take away from the best tool they'd have to understand the game, which is just playing it. This is me of the future talking. Thanks for watching along or listening along to today's video. I've been playing the Wilds Open Beta, and when the game comes out, I fully intend to make content around that, as well as other games I enjoy. While Monster Hunter is my favorite series, and I intend to primarily make videos about it, I also want to make videos talking about and exploring different themes or topics regarding other games that I enjoy. If that sounds appealing, or if you'd like to hear something about a specific game or series, drop it in the comments. Thanks again for watching. I hope you have a great day, and if it's not, I hope you can find a reason to smile anyway. See you in the next one.